Hello, everyone. The Liberty Power Hour is on. Welcome to Freedom Watch, a 60-minute injection of raw liberty, streaming from the highly acclaimed Strategy Room on FoxNews.com. I'm your host, Judge Andrew Napolitano. We'll discuss the issues that profoundly affect your freedom, your civil liberties, your financial liberties, and your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. This week, we learned that if you disagree with the president on health care, the White House wants to know who you are. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from abridging the freedom of speech. The reason the amendment refers to speech as the freedom of speech is a recognition by the framers that the right to speak freely precedes the existence of the United States as a country. The framers recognized it as a natural right, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. A natural right which comes to all persons by virtue of our humanity. The right to speak freely does not come from the government, which the big government folks claim. It is an indelible aspect of our humanity. The Supreme Court has endorsed the concept of the natural as opposed to the governmental origins of this right. And hence, even though the First Amendment only prohibits Congress from abridging the freedom of speech, the court has ruled that no one in any government, from a school janitor to a state governor, from a board of education to a local cop, from the courts to the Congress to the president, may interfere with speech. Because speech can startle and offend, as well as enlighten and illuminate, the courts have held that it requires breathing room. Stated differently, no one in the government, any government, may impose a burden on the exercise of speech. That means that the government may not require a license, demand permission, intimidate speakers, or punish speakers, no matter what the speaker says. The constitutional rule is this: all innocuous speech is absolutely protected, and all speech is innocuous when there is time for more speech to address the same subject matter. Joining me now, not only to talk about speech, but to talk about health care, not only to talk about what the president is doing now, but what presidents in the past have done, is Thomas Woods, the author of 9 books, including the recent New York Times bestseller, Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. Tom, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.
The issue that I talked about that had me so steamed, Tom, was, of course, this entreaty, this request on the White House website that if anybody says anything to you, even whispers anything to you, that is fishy, to use their word, they really mean critical in any way of the president's health care plan, you ought to tell us. Now, I know you're a historian and an award-winning economist, but you know this stuff as well as I do. Aren't there laws that basically say the government is not supposed to monitor our speech? And the First Amendment, which protects free speech, protects anonymous speech.
Well, absolutely.
So who is the government to say, tell us who's speaking against us? We want their name, address, telephone number, and email site.
Well, thankfully, because this has happened in the past, we know how people like Thomas Jefferson responded. In 1798, you know very well about the Alien and Sedition Acts that made it a crime to criticize the president or the Congress. You could be thrown in jail or fined for it. And Jefferson's response was what today sounds very radical to us, was to say, this is so obviously unconstitutional that only a boob would support it. So he argued that the states should just refuse to enforce a law like that. If it's unconstitutional, then it's not really a law. I mean, he was calling on the states to consider standing up to the federal government as states. But this is all part, Judge, of a broader campaign really to demonize opposition to the president, demonize opposition to the health care plan. I mean, I heard Chris Matthews the other day saying that most of these opponents of Obama, really, their problem is that they just can't deal with a black president. And then today or yesterday, Congressman Dingell was saying that opponents of the president remind him of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, talk about, I mean, what do they think is going to help? How's it going to help their situation to enrage people further by comparing them to the Ku Klux Klan? It doesn't even make sense from their own point of view. They just don't know how to respond to this kind of criticism.
The concept of the states nullifying something that the federal government has done, which of course is not taught in the schools anymore, but which was natural to Jefferson and Madison and the founding fathers. For all we know, even that big government guy Hamilton, who wanted George Washington to be king, understood nullification, has really existed throughout our history. In fact, isn't it true that one of the most effective uses of nullification, Tom, was the state of Massachusetts nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act? The Fugitive Slave Act basically said, the federal government dictating to the states, if a slave escapes from the South and makes his or her way to the North, and you kidnap that person and return that person to their owner in the South, you cannot be prosecuted by any of the states for kidnapping. The state of Massachusetts said, forget about it. If you kidnap a slave or any person, an ex-slave in the state of Massachusetts, we'll prosecute you. Isn't that an early and acceptable use, a constitutionally legitimate use of state nullification?
Absolutely. In fact, even more vivid could be the Wisconsin Supreme Court in 1859 defending Wisconsin's extremely lax enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which had all kinds of constitutional outrages in it. And how did they defend themselves? In 1859, they quoted Thomas Jefferson from 1798 in his Kentucky resolutions of that year, saying that the federal government has only the powers that are delegated to it. The states have the remainder, and if the federal government goes beyond those powers, as it did in that particular law, then it could be nullified. Now, we get told all the time that the only reason you could support these state sovereignty movements or states' rights is, you probably secretly support slavery or segregation and all this. But as you say, Judge, you look through American history, states' rights have been used on behalf of peace, on behalf of free trade, free speech, anti-fugitive slave laws, but this part of our history is to be suppressed so that we can get the version that tells us, hey, you can't possibly want local self-government because that leads to slavery. You need to let your overlords in Washington run everything. In fact, there was a very hostile, I won't mention her name, member of the press who was interviewing me recently, and I was talking about the views that you and I hold and the topics we discuss on this program, and we're talking about war and the Fed and all these and civil liberties, and she said, sounds like segregation in the 60s to me. And I thought, it does? I thought, what kind of a sick, twisted, emotional hypochondriac are you? Because she hears states' rights, that's what she thinks. And so I said to her, well, why doesn't states' rights remind you of Daniel Webster in 1814 standing in front of the Congress and saying, if the federal government attempts military conscription, we in Massachusetts will not permit one person to be conscripted here. Why doesn't it remind her of that? Because she was never taught that?
Right.
Because it's her job to shut down lines of thought the regime doesn't approve of. And finally, for anybody who's trying to say that there is some kind of racial agenda behind this, my response, which is so absurd, I said to her, think of the issues that most motivate the Ron Paul wing of the Republican Party. I would say there are three I hear the most often: war, the Fed, and the war on drugs. Now, if I wanted to oppress blacks, I would keep those policies just the way they are.
Well, the war on drugs is a very interesting one, because this would actually appeal to a lot of folks who are adverse to the ideas that you and I and the good people that are watching and listening to us now embrace. And in some states, there actually is a form of nullification of the federal laws prohibiting marijuana by the state laws prohibiting the medical use of marijuana. And we actually have mirabile dictu, as they used to teach us in Latin, a wonder to speak of. An attorney general has said, you know what? If a state authorizes medical marijuana, unlike in the Bush administration, when they put people in jail for following the state law, we will not enforce the federal law in those states. That's a form not only of state nullification, but of a federal recognition and acceptance of state nullification.
Absolutely. And these sorts of concepts that you and I are describing right now need to be detoxified before the American public, because how else do you honestly expect to resist a government of this kind of power if you're not going to exercise every constitutionally legitimate option at your disposal? And just remember, if you read Mein Kampf and you read what Hitler had to say about states' rights, it's not a coincidence that he despises the concept, because it makes it very difficult for a dictator to exercise absolute power. Well, you don't say.
Tom, before I let you go, the president was elated this week when the reports showed unemployment went down from 9.5 to 9.4. And he and those who pushed the big government stimulus and solving a problem